is Dr. Kirsten DeWitt, who will present on the DAYS project. Dr. DeWitt.
Thank you so much for allowing me to present on the DAYS pilot study. This is a collaboration between CanVector and the Dutch Thrombosis Network. The Wells model for deep vein thrombosis diagnosis was first published in 1995. And 2 years later, a simplified version of this model was published. This is the same model that we use today. There are 9 components, and some components have multiple items. So when a physician applies the Wells score for deep vein thrombosis, they have to assess a total of 13 items. We previously interviewed emergency physicians to establish how they test for deep vein thrombosis, and we found that they don't use the Wells score, often opting for a standalone proximal ultrasound instead. When we asked them why, they said,
"The challenge would be just to memorize it."
Wells, there's too many variables.
Wells is long. There's always one element that I usually forget.
Taking the time to sort of look up the tool and what have you, it might only take a minute, but it's a minute where you could have been seeing the next patient or finishing up your charting or whatever.
Using this information, we derived a new simple decision tool for deep vein thrombosis testing. We used individual patient data from 4 previous diagnostic deep vein thrombosis studies, and we modeled this new decision tool on the years decision tool for pulmonary embolism testing. Because it's modeled on the years, we called it the DAYS algorithm for deep vein thrombosis testing. It consists of DVT being the most likely diagnosis, there being calf swelling of a minimum of 3 centimeters of the affected leg, and D-dimer. Not only is it a simple test, but is also highly sensitive, moderately specific, and in the derivation cohort, it was able to rule out deep vein thrombosis without imaging in 43% of cases. So the aim of this pilot study is to assess the rate of recruitment to the study, 90-day loss to follow-up, and to estimate the proportion of patients who have deep vein thrombosis excluded with and without deep vein thrombosis imaging. This is a prospective management study. It's conducted in emergency departments in Canada and the Netherlands. The patient is recruited if the physician tests them for deep vein thrombosis of the lower limb. There will be 250 patients recruited to the pilot study. The exclusions include being anticoagulated, under the age of 18, having previously been diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis when there's no baseline imaging accessible, or presenting with symptoms of pulmonary embolism. If the emergency physician knows the results of the D-dimer before they calculate the DAYS items, then the patient will not be included. This is the DAYS flowchart. So the physician starts with assessment to see if deep vein thrombosis is the most likely diagnosis or whether there is more than 3 centimeters of calf swelling. If neither exists, then they will use a D-dimer threshold of 1,000 nanograms per mil to exclude deep vein thrombosis. If either of those exist, then the physician will use a D-dimer threshold of 500 to exclude deep vein thrombosis without diagnostic imaging. The outcome for the full study is the false negative rate, which is the rate of pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis diagnosed within 90 days of having negative testing using the DAYS algorithm. This is independently adjudicated blinded to the DAYS score. The pilot study, however, will be assessing the patient enrollment rate per site per month that we estimate should be a minimum of 5. The proportion of patients who cannot be reached at 90 days for their follow-up, and the proportion of patients who test negative at their initial deep vein thrombosis assessment, along with the estimate of the DAYS algorithm efficiency. We already have a grant from Queen's University, which covers a cost per patient recruited, which will be sent to recruitment sites. We need further funding to fund a part-time study coordinator. So in conclusion, the Wells score is complex and is seldom used. The DAYS score is simple. We propose a pilot study which will lead to an international study which we hope to include multiple INVENT members in to assess the safety and efficiency of DAYS testing for deep vein thrombosis. And DAYS has the potential to change emergency medicine practice. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. David. The Dragon, the floor is yours.
I'll kindly let Simon go first this time.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Phil Wells is watching this, but I can imagine him desperately trying to record that soundbite, Wells is long, and playing it to himself over and over again. Kirsten, my first question is, as a Scot, I'd just like you to say, who do you think's the best football team in the Euro 2021 at the moment?
You know what? I am not a soccer team fan.
I don't care.
But I did hear on the grapevine that maybe England are in the finals.
England are most definitely in the finals. So, Gregoire, you just remember that next time you diss me.
What about the Wales?
Are cancer patients excluded from this because of my concern being the elevated D-dimer?
Absolutely not. In fact, I have been heading a whole program on producing standards for the ISTH in cancer patients for testing for deep vein thrombosis. And we've just completed a systematic review and meta-analysis that shows that D-dimer is highly sensitive with a standard cutoff of 500, even in cancer patients. We've also established that the utility is around 10 to 15% in cancer patients with a negative D-dimer.
Thank you. And then my next question, I know that long Phil Wells will be very sad to know that despite his wonderful work, people aren't using it. How do you know that the short days is going to be used? Because that's the only way. You say it's practice changing. No matter how bright and sparkly it is, if people don't use it, it's just another, it's as much help as a 17th meta-analysis of DOACs versus low molecular weight heparin in cancer.
You're exactly right. I intend to implement the study here in Canada by having the DAYS become the standard algorithm in participating emergency departments. So we will have the opportunity to evaluate the uptake of the DAYS algorithm. If the patient's tested for deep vein thrombosis by using another algorithm, then they're not eligible to participate in DAYS. So we'll be following the missed eligible cases with this pilot study.
I'm now very happy to hand over to the great Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. So Kirsten, you're an emergency medicine physician, aren't you?
Correct.
Okay. The stereotype on Twitter is that all emergency medicine physicians wear Patagonia sweatshirts, they ride their bikes to work, and they like to keep things simple. And I have the same concerns as Dr. Noble. I know that this work builds on the 4D study and PEGED, where clinical probability adjusted D-dimer is used for diagnostic management. But I also wonder, what is the uptake going to be in a very busy emergency department of having to figure out whether the D-dimer is above this level or below this level, and that somehow guides management? What do you think?
I think that's a really important point. I think one of the important ways to implement this is through the electronic medical record so that the physician is guided. So for example, when they order the D-dimer, if they're testing for deep vein thrombosis, they have to enter the DAYS items, and that will tell them what the D-dimer cutoff is that they should use. So we have to automate this as much as possible.
Kirsten, since you are on the D-dimer cutoff, there was a question from Alison Bond asking, are all D-dimers interchangeable?
Yeah.
And what do you plan to do for that?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the full question, but I think perhaps you're referring to, can we use all D-dimer assays? Yeah. So we will only include a recruitment site if their current assay has a manufacturer recommended cutoff of 500, or depending what units used, but in nanograms per mil, 500. So we won't be using any sites that are already using a D-dimer that has a different cutoff. For example, some versions of the IL test, you have a cutoff around 270.
Good. One last burning question from the dragon. So can we, or from the audience, so can we move on? Yes, we can. Very good. Thank you, Kirsten.